Just the next room over.
I want to look at all the stuff so we can reference it.
Yeah, great.
Okay, everybody, I think we're ready to start our next program, and it's going to be a really good one. So this program and this author and guest is key to a successful Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival. I think he's probably one of my favorites. Him and his wife Diane come in, and they travel in from Pennsylvania. She's sitting up here in the front. But I have the very distinct honor of introducing a very good friend of mine, my brother, Dr. Larry Cook. He is a nationally recognized, I think internationally recognized, author of two very successful books. And he'll be out in the front signing his latest book, and I think he has a few copies of the first book as well after the program. But I've met a lot of presidential historians in the world that I come from, and he is probably the best that out there for information-wise. So if there's any questions that you want to think about in history and first families and everything, this is the guy to talk to. So I have the honor of introducing Dr. Larry Cook with an amazing presentation for all of you. Dr. Cook.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that very, very much. It was a great introduction, better than I deserve, I think, but I love you. Thank you. And how great is it to be here and live, right? Right? We are just so excited. We're so excited to get here, and as he mentioned, we're from Pennsylvania. We drive here. Got a little whiteout in Indianapolis, but we got through it, and that was good. Didn't expect that, but we're getting to travel a lot. Matter of fact, I'm going to be several different places. I'll be doing an online for Sagamore Hill, but I'll be out in Illinois for 3 different events in June. I'll be in New York State in May. I'll be doing a keynote DAR organization speech also in May, in a museum in Binghamton, New York in May. So it's great that this COVID is lifting, and I know there's a lot of others of you, Lewis, who speak, and we're all grateful to have this being lifted, and we're getting back to some normalcy. So glad to see you here. We're going to talk a little bit about the Symbols of Patriotism, my latest book. I'm going to toot my own horn here because I'm very proud of this book. And I'll tell you a little bit about how it came about kind of in a non-conventional way. My expertise is really in the presidency's personal side and little-known facts on the presidents. But the way this book came about is, I mentioned I'm speaking at a DAR group, and I'll be speaking at a lot more, I guess, because of this book. But about 2 years ago, I was asked by our local DAR chapter to be their keynote speaker for their annual meeting. And I thought, well, I wonder if there were any first ladies that were in the DAR. I was sure there had to be. And little did I know, one of my good friends, Rosalind Carter, was in the DAR, but I didn't even know that. And I'd been friends with her and President Carter for 16 years. So I did a little preliminary research and found quickly that there were like 5 or 6. So I went there, I spoke on the 5 or 6 first ladies that I had found, and my wife was there, my stepdaughter was there, and it was a big hit. And my wife said, you got to do more of the first ladies, People really enjoyed it. So I called Nicholas Inman. Now, I know a lot of you in here know Nicholas, the director of this Cherry Blossom Festival, and he loves First Lady history. So we were just talking, and what have you been doing? I said, oh, I was a keynote speaker for DAR Group. And he said, really? There were that many First Ladies in there? I said, yeah, just in a quick search. He said, you ought to write a book on that. I said, well, I don't know. Well, if you know Nicholas, Nicholas will stay on you. So him and I talk every couple of weeks. 2 weeks later, hey, did you start that book yet? 2 weeks later, did you start that book yet? I said, yeah. Pretty soon I thought, well, that is a good idea. Let me do a little more research. So I did a little more research, came up with about 4 more. So now we're looking at 9, 10. So I dug deeper and deeper and ended up finding 12. And so another good friend of mine who just spoke up here, Tim Pletkovich, he and I talk about once a month on the phone. So he calls me, what are you doing? I said, oh, Nick's got me looking into this manuscript for this new book. He says, oh, I think that's great. And about 2 days later, Tim calls me and said, my publisher, Vandermeer Press, would like to talk to you about that book. So I said, okay. And I'm thinking, oh, this guy's doing it as a favor for Tim, but I'll call him. And I called the guy, Art Brown at Vandermeer Press, very nice guy. He said, have you got any done yet, any chapters done? I said, yeah, I got a couple of done. He said, send them to me, and let's see. So I sent him a couple of chapters. 2 days later, he calls back. He says, we want to contract the book. So that was great, because I'd really intended on, if I did the book at all, I was going to self-publish it, because I didn't want to go through all these, sending it out everywhere, getting the rejections, all that kind of stuff. So we signed the contract on the book, and about a month later, the COVID quarantine came. So that kind of snagged me up on the research part a little bit. But on the other side of the coin, it gave me a lot of time to write the book, because we were, at that time, like everywhere else, and we were in Pennsylvania, but we were locked down. You couldn't go anywhere. So I started doing the manuscript. I joined a couple of genealogical sites to get some reference. And I was very, very lucky, though, because I'm good friends with a few people that, one, as I mentioned, Rosalind Carter, who's in the book, good friends with Clifton Truman Daniel, his grandmother's in the book, good friends with Mary Eisenhower, her grandmother's in the book. So I had a few people I could call. And like Clifton put me in touch with somebody at the Truman Library. And it was neat, because I called Clifton and I said, tell me about your grandmother being in the DAR. He said, she was? I was like, cool, this is going to be a good book. So he put me in touch, and a picture of the book in the book of Bess's invitation is in there. But what I didn't include in the book, which was really cool, when the person at the Truman Library sent me that, they also sent me the envelope that it was in. It sent me a picture of the envelope that it was in. And on the envelope, it's got written coffee. So she had used that envelope as a grocery list. I thought that was pretty cool. I couldn't wait to call Clifton and tell him. And so Rosalind gave me a couple stories which are in the book that you won't hear anywhere else. Mary shared some things with me, which I'll touch on, a couple of them that you won't hear anywhere else. It's kind of had to come from the family to hear it. So that's the story behind the book. It took me about a year to write it. And it's a small book, but again, and I'm not saying this to get a gold star or anything like that, but it was a tremendous amount of work on the genealogy part. At the end of each First Lady's chapter, I list her ancestors that would have made her eligible to be in the DAR. Now, I had no way of knowing if it was the one that they actually used. And you'll see in the book, some of them have 1, some of them have, I had to stop Eleanor Roosevelt at like 5. And some have 2, some have 3, etc. But another little story, and we'll get on to talking about some of the First Ladies, but I was doing all that research, and again, I was kind of handcuffed, because I just could do either what I did online, but I'm lucky too, because I have a very extensive library, personal library, over 1,000 books, and some of them go back to the time of these people, not just the ones from the 70s, 80s, 90s, but even some from the 1800s. I have books from those times. And we have a very large collection. The collection gets more renowned, I guess, as we talk about it. It's probably one of the largest collections in the United States of presidential memorabilia. It exceeds 8,000 pieces. So we've got like 17 pieces here that brought to show you, and this is typical of what I do at my presentations, is bring memorabilia pertaining to who I'm talking about. But I was on NPR about 3 weeks ago, and the host on NPR said I had the biggest collection in the world. So it went from one of the biggest in the United States to the biggest. And then I think somebody else said that too. Richard said that when he was introducing me. But it's a big collection, but we really enjoy it, and we like to use it. So, but anyway, getting back to my genealogy story. So I had no way of knowing if it was the one that they actually used. And I got all the genealogy done, and I was looking up something else on Florence Harding, and her ancestor was Captain Edmund Richards. And I had a hard time finding her ancestor. Found that she was in the DAR, but I had a hard time finding it. So after I was all done with everything, I was looking up something else on her, and I don't know why this didn't come up before, but it didn't. And all of a sudden this DAR publication from, I believe it was 1923, comes up announcing that she had joined the DAR and she had used Captain Edmund Richards as her person. And I was like, yes, I got at least one. That was used. So that was pretty cool. So imagine having a job, though, that you don't get paid for. You're in the limelight, under the microscope, whatever analogy you want to use, more than probably anybody other than your husband. You don't get paid. There really is no job description. And it's just like one of us in here, and suddenly you're the First Lady of the United States. And the age ranges tremendously. From George's grandmother being the youngest to right up through. And, it amazes me how not only the presidents were thrust into that position, but their wives. And even more, we got to think about that even more, I guess, than the president, because the president, or at least the candidate, they're seeking that for the most part. Now, some of the vice presidents who were put in there upon the death of a president, they may not have thought they would really become president, but still they were in there as the vice president. They were thinking about it. But the first lady, and again, doesn't get paid, and there's no real job description. And when they started out, they didn't even know what to call the first lady. Martha Washington, Lady Washington, some would call them Mrs. President. It ran the gambit. And I can imagine some things, probably titles that people probably put on them. But, and you'll still find in memorabilia sometimes, you'll see like Mrs. President so-and-so. They'll label that. But what I tried to do with this book, because I could have written a whole book on each one of these 12, but what I tried to do is highlight their remarkable life and how they really helped their husband to get to the presidency. And it really amazed me, especially some of the earlier ones. And we'll start out talking about Sarah Polk, how active they were. I didn't even realize that. But Sarah Polk, she really acted as what we would think now as a chief advisor, a press secretary, and chief of staff for her husband. And she would even go out and talk to the press, which, doesn't that amaze you? Like you're back in the mid-1800s, and the first lady's going out and talking to the press. I didn't even really realize that until I got into my research. And she was very, very smart. I mean, she would go out and talk to the press, and she would give her own opinions on issues, but she would make it sound like it came from her husband. That was pretty clever. And she was a true gatekeeper for her husband. She would limit access to him, even by high officials, such as his Secretary of State, James Buchanan, who later became president, would get frustrated because he couldn't always walk in and see the president anytime he wanted to. And I thought that was pretty cool, because back then, as you know, or as many of you know, you could walk in the White House to see the president, and it took up a lot of the president's time. But Sarah Polk was really a gatekeeper for her husband. And she was also known as Sahara Sarah, because she would not, it was a dry White House. She would not let alcoholic beverages be served. So she got that nickname. See what I said they called some of these first ladies? But so she got that nickname early on. But I found that astounding that she talked to the press and she was so closely guarded her husband. And she was able to do that a little bit more too because they never had any children. So that allowed her, even when he was Speaker of the House, you know, in Congress and then Speaker of the House, she could go to Washington. She could spend a lot of time helping him. So she was kind of geared up to be First Lady from that aspect. And then when they left the White House, Polk was very happy to retire after one term. And he was very happy that Sarah acted as she did because he didn't really care to talk to people too much anyway. He wasn't a real people person. But unfortunately, they were so eager to go into retirement. And then unfortunately, 3 months after he left the White House, he passed away at 53 years old. So he had the shortest retirement in history of a president. And Sarah, at that time, things were very different with the papers and stuff of the presidents. So Sarah put things out on display in their home as a monument to her late husband. And she wore black mainly for the rest of her life. And she always signed all of her correspondence, Mrs. James K. Polk. And you'll see in my book, I have a print from a DAR, from one of the first DAR rosters. And she's listed in there as Mrs. James K. Polk. So she always honored her husband in that way. And we'll talk a little bit quickly about some of the memorabilia here. But I don't have anything directly related to Sarah yet. I'm on the hunt for something. But this is a lithograph from 1844, 1845. And it shows James K. Polk down here. And I like this very much because it lists him as president-elect. So this came out right after the election. And the next First Lady that we're going to talk about is Caroline Harrison. And I really enjoyed all of these First Ladies. I really enjoyed learning more about them and studying them and writing about them. But Caroline Harrison, very interesting. How many DAR members do we have in here? Got one here, one here. Any others? One back there? 3. We got my wife, who's a DAR member in waiting. She's just got her application all together and going to sign that when we go back. And that's another cool little story we'll tell you about toward the end if we can, if we do have time. But so far, getting off of Caroline Harrison for a second, but I'm very proud of this fact. So far, I think we've got 7 women that have joined the DAR as a result of my book coming out that I know of. So I'm very happy. I think 3 of them are in the Inman family here as well. So I'm very, very happy about that. That's what history is all about, to inspire people. And that makes me feel so good. But Caroline Harrison was the first President General of the DAR. So when the DAR was formed, they asked her to be the first President General. Lent a lot of credibility and a lot of publicity to the newly formed DAR to have the First Lady be the first President General. So when Caroline Harrison came in the White House with her husband Benjamin, one of her first priorities was to remodel. Back then the White House was kind of got into deplorable conditions. Part of the reason is what I mentioned before, is anybody could just walk in. Can you imagine that? The foot traffic that came through there. And so Caroline Harrison decided to get some money allotted from Congress and remodel the White House. And one of the things that she did when she remodeled the White House was install electricity. And that was great, but she and the president were scared to death of it. And they wouldn't touch the light switches. So they would leave the lights on all night long until a staff person came in the morning to shut them off. Now that's mind-boggling there too, because you think about the White House now and you think about then. You waited for a staff person to come in to shut the lights off. I mean, compared to what it is today. But she actually wanted to do a whole lot more to the White House, but couldn't get the money. But got a certain amount of money and did remodeling, plumbing, things like that, I think mainly, but then the electricity. So Caroline also was very instrumental in starting the White House China collection. She, and if I forget, when I get to Harding, somebody raise their hand and say, tell us the China story. But she did that, and that was even continued on by Edith Roosevelt later years. But she started, also Caroline started the first White House Christmas tree tradition, which we all know of today. So again, going back to my point, and I'll say this a couple other times, there is no job description for the First Lady, other than, and this isn't even official, but hostess for the White House. So each First Lady could really make the job what they wanted it to be, but yet it's kind of tough because there's really no job description. And as you know, with politics, you're walking on eggshells all the time, so whatever your agendas are scrutinized, and whatever you do within the White House, even spending to remodel, I'm sure is scrutinized by some. Unfortunately, Caroline passed away in 1892, and she passed away in the White House as First Lady. As you know, Grover Cleveland was elected president, ran for re-election. Benjamin Harrison came in, won the election, took Grover out of the White House. 4 years later, Grover comes back for 1892 and runs against Benjamin Harrison and wins the election, making Grover the only president to serve 2 terms non-consecutively. So 2 weeks before that election day where Grover won the presidency back, Caroline passed away in the White House. And that's mind-boggling. I mean, I get involved in the lives of these presidents because I'm dealing with it every day. And I know it sounds a little corny. I was telling them earlier that, you know, I have a lot of these 8,000 pieces out on display, and it makes me feel obligated to do a good job when I walk in my office and all these presidents and first ladies are looking at me. But because they did a ton of stuff to get where they are and serve this nation. But I have this letter here from Benjamin Harrison, dated June 13th, 1892, and I'm just going to read you part of it. But it says, Mrs. Harrison continues to suffer from nervous prostration and makes a very tedious recovery. I do not know when I will be able to get her away or to get away myself for a little rest, which I may very much need. Very sincerely yours, Benjamin Harrison. And so that's, and about, I believe about, within the next few months, she had passed away. So that type of letter, when you deal on the personal side of the presidency like I do, that type of letter is just really what you look for. And you just imagine how he felt when he was writing that letter. Now, Benjamin Harrison, well, let me back up a little bit. When Caroline was First Lady, her niece, Mary Lord Dimmock, came in to help her with her duties. And as I mentioned, she then passed away 2 weeks before Election Day. Caroline did. But a few years later, Benjamin ended up marrying Caroline's niece, Mary Lord Dimmock. And that caused a big row in the family, of course. Benjamin's kids did not like it at all. He was a former president, of course, then. But if you looked at things up here, I have an envelope here signed by Mary Lord Harrison, Benjamin Harrison's second wife. And on the reverse, it says Mrs. Benjamin Harrison on the reverse of the envelope. And this is called free franking, so they would write their name up there and they didn't have to pay postage if they were a president's president or president's wife. Seeing that we just had a baseball thing up here, I got to tell you a quick little baseball story with that concerns Benjamin Harrison. Now, Benjamin Harrison, as a former president, he was on a lecture run, and he went out to Stanford University to lecture. And there was a baseball game going on with Stanford and some other team. So the former president decided to go there to the baseball game. So when he went, he inadvertently went through the ticket place and didn't pay. Didn't mean to do it, he just did it. And I'm sure as a former president, and he's going to give a speech, probably got other things on his mind. Anyway, he walks through the gate and doesn't pay. The admission was $0.25. So the captain of the baseball team was responsible for collecting the admission fee. So the captain of the baseball team sees the former president go through, so he runs after him to get the quarter. Stops him, and President Harrison was very embarrassed about it, and instead of giving him a quarter, he gave him $1 and told him he'll take 4 tickets. The young man that he gave the $1 to was Herbert Hoover, was the captain. I love that story. That is a favorite story whenever I tell it. And Herbert Hoover said that that was his first encounter with greatness when he stopped the former president. Julia Grant, again, I'm going to say this every time so you guys are, yeah. I loved writing about her. But I was amazed at Julia Grant because, first of all, she was a very unlikely first lady when you think about it. She came from a plantation family. She married Ulysses, who of course came from an abolitionist family. So she was a very unlikely first lady. Don't have time to get into how they met and everything, but you know, that right there amazes me. And Julia was such a cheerleader for her husband all the time. Ulysses was a great general, of course, a great army officer, but he wasn't really ever very successful in other businesses. And, you know, but the military he was. But she was always a cheerleader through the good times and the bad times for him. And she had premonitions of greatness for him. She would say things to people like, wait until Ulysses gets to this point, or wait till he becomes president. And I just find that amazing, how she was just, through the bad times, she just knew he was destined for greatness. And speaking of Grant, I'm going to give my friend Lewis here a little plug. He'll be here on Saturday speaking about his new book on Ulysses Grant, so you want to try to make that. You'll hear a lot more about Ulysses Grant from my friend and colleague Louis Picone. But the other thing I like to talk about with General Grant, because this is an original cabinet card of the general, and this is a signed document, and this is Ulysses' signature here on this document. But we look at this and you think, you know, what a rough and tough old general, you know, type of guy. But he really was romantic when you study Julia. Julia was born with strabismus. Everybody know what strabismus is? It's crossed eyes. And so you'll notice in most of the renderings or photos, a few photos, but most of the renderings of Julia, you'll notice she's at a profile because people were very conscious of her strabismus and didn't want to do an image of her straight on most of the time. So when she started to get more into the public, as he became a famous general and, you know, interacting with a lot of people, she had heard of an experimental surgical correction for the strabismus. And so when she went to Ulysses about it, he begged her not to do it. And he said, I don't want you to do it because the eyes that you have now are the eyes that I fell in love with. Well, that always gets, I love that. And, but he was a real romantic. He was just very, oh no, I started at 10:30. Okay, I'm thinking 10 o'clock. I'm thinking, wow. The other story that I really love about him is when he and Julia were going out and they went on a carriage ride and they were going across a stream that had been recently encountered a lot of rain and it was raging through. And she was afraid to go across the bridge. And he assured her that he'd get her across the bridge okay. So she held onto his arm as they went across the bridge. And when they got to the other side, that's when he proposed to her and said that, you know, you can cling to me for the rest of your life. Again, another, He was such a romantic. I love it. The other fascinating thing, and I talk a little bit more about this in the book, but she would visit the Civil War camps, and she would bring with her her slave Jewel, and they would together provide medical aid to the soldiers. And that's just really ironic on a lot of different levels. First of all, she would come to the military camps That was one thing. And then the union camps, and she brings with her Jewel, and they both functioned as medical providers for the troops. So a lot of interesting things could go on and on. Get to Florence Harding. I laugh when I get to Florence Harding. Florence Harding she was just something else. First of all, she was a divorced single mother. And back in those days, you're talking pre-20s there, that was kind of scandalous in and of itself. Then she got hooked up with Warren, and Warren had some nervous breakdown type problems and actually went into an institution for a while. And she took over the Marion newspaper, which Warren ran. And she just ran it with an iron fist. And she did well, did really well with the newspaper. Publication increased. She did very good. And I won't give this all away because if you read the book, but she was even known to go out and discipline the newsboys when they were not performing up to standards. So she made no secret about her personality, I guess we'll put it that way. She felt like she got Warren the presidency, and she didn't care if she told people that. She would go out and talk to the press and tell them, I got him the presidency, and the president does well when he listens to me, and when he doesn't do well. Imagine the First Lady going out and talking, boy, CNN, Fox, all them, they would have a blast with that, wouldn't they? And she even said to Warren when he was elected, well, Warren, I got you the presidency, now what are you going to do with it? Now, she was very, very much on a lot of issues, very much on animal rights. She was very much on veterans issues. And then, matter of fact, her last public appearance, she stood up to applaud veterans walking by in a parade as a former First Lady. And like Nancy Reagan, she was into astrology. And when Warren was running for president, or trying to seek the nomination, at least for president, she consulted an astrologer who predicted that he would become president, but that he would die in office, which he did. Doesn't that send chills up your spine? I mean, it really does. It's really crazy. This group of photos here shows Florence at the bottom photo, and they're greeting some wounded soldiers here that are in wheelchairs and such. So that's really apropos for Florence Harding and her. And like Eleanor Roosevelt, she was very much into promoting female professionals, female journalists, things like that, allowing them special access and stuff, because she was really for professional women getting their careers going. Eleanor Roosevelt, a lot to say about Eleanor Roosevelt. Why? Because she was the longest serving First Lady. So as you probably know, Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times, putting Eleanor in there as the longest serving First Lady. See, like I'll go back to the beginning of what I said, everything that your husband did, it influences you, good or bad. But Eleanor was a First Lady who really kind of expanded the role, so to speak, of the First Lady. I mean, she traveled more than other First Ladies. I don't want to say she was more outspoken because, as we just mentioned, Florence was pretty outspoken. But she did a lot of writing, a lot of columns for magazines, made her opinions known. And it's a remarkable story with Eleanor because she started out life really terrible. I mean, she was basically, orphaned. Her father and mother both died at a young age. And she was not the cutest little kid. And even her family would say comments like, she's an ugly duckling who will hopefully become a swan. And I mean, that's tough, when you're a kid. And I just can't imagine. But she went off to boarding school, and her headmaster at the school, Marie Silvestri, if I'm saying that right, really instilled her confidence back in her. And it's really ironic because she took what she learned from Marie Silvestri and she applied that to her husband after he got polio. Had it been up to FDR's mother, when FDR got polio, she would have had him just retire as a wealthy retiree and just do nothing. And Eleanor had a lot of friction with FDR's mother. She was, when people make jokes about mother-in-laws, there you go. And so they had a lot of friction there. But Eleanor really went against her mother-in-law there and really encouraged FDR to seek the governorship of New York, which he did. And I just love that because she overcame her struggles as a child, took what she learned, and applied them to her husband and changed history in a huge way. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to mention about Eleanor. The last thing, Eleanor was a member of the DAR, but as you'll read in the book, she resigned from the DAR in 1939. And she resigned over a civil rights issue. A lady by the name of Marian Anderson, an African-American singer, was not allowed to perform at Constitution Hall. And Constitution Hall, if you don't know, is the main headquarters for the DAR. And so Eleanor resigned over that issue. But she arranged a concert at the Lincoln Memorial, and in today's terms, it went viral. I mean, it was broadcast all over, thousands of people showed up. It was just a big, big boom for Marian Anderson. And just so I don't forget to mention that, Marian Anderson has been invited to other inaugurations. I believe Mamie Eisenhower, in 1953, invited her to sing at Ike's inauguration. So, but she did resign in protest, and it just shows she's somebody that stuck to her principles. You will notice in the back of my book, I did, in an appendix, put the entire Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the back of the book. And I told the publisher that's a must. I got to do it. I felt strongly about it because Eleanor Roosevelt was so involved with the formation of that. And I felt strongly about it because the Carters mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's one of the first things I remember President Carter talking about when we first got to know them. So I wanted to put it in there for two first ladies. I wanted to put it in there for Eleanor and for Rosalind, whose first name is Eleanor. Did anybody know that or not know that? But I know some people in here know that. Yeah, Jan, I know, Jan. But I find that really ironic. I'm skipping ahead to Rosalind a little bit, but you see a lot of similarities with Eleanor Roosevelt and Rosalind Carter. And while I'm on the subject, it is Rosalind, not like the press still pronounces it, Rosalind. I had a laugh the other day. I told Diane, I said, look at this on Facebook. Somebody had this, it was on a presidential site, and somebody had this whole thing admonishing people about the mispronunciation of Rosalind's name, but in their thing they had it spelled wrong. Like, well, you tried. Edith Roosevelt, of course, Teddy Roosevelt's wife, his second wife, actually. For those of you that don't know, Teddy Roosevelt's first wife, Alice, died on the same day as Teddy's mother. That's what set Teddy into a tailspin, had him go out west, and again, that changed history. But Edith was one of Teddy's first playmates. They grew up next to each other. There's a little fuzzy on the history there, whether they were really boyfriend, girlfriend, or not, but then they kind of went their separate ways as they got a little bit old into their older teens, and it never really materialized. Until after Alice passed away, Teddy goes out west, Teddy comes back, visits his sister, and his old friend Edith is there. And so they kindled up a relationship from that meeting, and that's how Edith became First Lady. The other little known fact that I just think is remarkable is I mentioned they were playmates. And when they were 4 years old, they stood in New York City at their houses together and watched Lincoln's funeral procession pass by. Another thing that gives you chills. But Edith was also a groundbreaking First Lady. I think they all were. But she had her office next to Teddy's in the White House. And she hired the first full-time staff member for the First Lady. Now, they did it kind of like under the table. They were planning Alice's wedding, Teddy's daughter from his first marriage, and so they brought the assistant in kind of under the guise of helping an assistant to help plan the wedding. But it was really an assistant to the First Lady, and it stuck there, and she remained on. She also hired the first usher, for the first White House usher. The little story I really love, have any of you heard of Pine Knot? It's a place, it's a cabin, I'm sure you have, in Virginia that Edith acquired for Teddy. She was always worried about him working too hard. She called him her fifth boy because she looked over him, looked after him so much. But she got a little cabin, which is named Pine Knot, for the president to go out and just relax and be away from everything. But what she did that the president didn't know she did is she had a Secret Service agent hiding in the woods every time the president was out there. Teddy wouldn't have went for that. We all know that. But so she never told him. But he was under guard and didn't know it when he was out in Pine Knot. What we have here is an original press photo from September 1935. The newspaper thing is taped to the back. I wish they hadn't glued it on there. I would like to read a little more there. But underneath the picture in the paper, it says, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. appeals for preservation of the Constitution. Now, if that doesn't fit into this DAR talk, wow. So I really just love that. Another quick little fact with her is she and Eleanor really didn't see eye to eye too great. And when FDR was up and coming in politics, and especially when he was running for president, a lot of people thought FDR was her son. So she didn't like that too much. Here's a cabinet card that's President Theodore Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt, souvenir of the visit, 1902. I would love to know where the visit was. And I love this little pin here. It says escort. Somebody wore that proudly and probably escorted the president around to whatever event that one was, and a few other little campaign buttons in there. I'm sorry to keep looking at my watch, but I just want to make sure we leave time for questions. Here's some correspondence by Edith Roosevelt, handwritten by her. I love this one. It says Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt on the printed card, and it says Sagamore Hill down there on the print of the card. Mamie Eisenhower, the one we're speaking of next. Again, I love these different little things, but this photo of the two presidents together on Inauguration Day, and wearing the top hats. Kennedy wasn't real big on wearing hats, but he did put the top hat on. I think it looks pretty cool, having the two presidents with the top hat on. This little piece here is signed by Mamie Eisenhower. And again, it really fits into our history discussion here because this is for historic Gettysburg, Adams County, and it was for a bricklaying event to preserve the village square. And this is signed by Mamie Eisenhower. All of these first ladies had an extreme dedication for history, and that comes out when you study these, and that's truly remarkable. I mean, I really felt like they did and they do feel that that's part of their unofficial duties to preserve history. So many of these, it gets into it a little more in my book, we don't have a lot of time, but so many of these first ladies brought things out of the archives and found them. So, and first ladies that aren't even up here. I really lump all first ladies into this patriot category because, you know, Jackie Kennedy is another one that, of course, did so much for the historic preservation. And of course, she's not in the book, but, you know, so many of them did it. And then even afterwards, they continued on. And, you know, from my own personal aspect with Rosalind Carter, there's about 5 people that convinced me to be a full-time historian. And that's Diane, my wife, my great friends Jan and George, and President and Mrs. Carter. And they just, you know, they come to my presentations there. They told me over and over again how much they love how I talk about the history and really encouraged me to do more and more of it. And so I thank the 3 that are here and the 2 that aren't because I love my job. We got Bess Truman next. This is a little signed card by Bess Truman. Of course, she's Missouri's favorite, right? And I think she's kind of a misunderstood First Lady a little bit because really, when you look in history, people say, well, she didn't really want to be First Lady. She didn't really do anything. I don't really think that's true. As I mentioned, I'm friends with Clifton Truman Daniel, who unfortunately couldn't be here this year, and he didn't think that's true either. The one thing with Bess Truman that most people don't really equate to her, when she was young, she was very athletic, a very athletic person, and a good athlete. And but she didn't have any real specific agendas as First Lady, but she supported a lot of humanitarian causes. You know, animal rescue. She was honorary president of the Girl Scouts or chairman of the Girl Scouts, things like that. So she did do things like that. She just really, I don't want to say it, she just really valued their privacy. And again, they were thrown into the presidency where they thought they may never have been there. He was, of course, vice president, Harry was, but she valued her privacy. She was even, you know, couldn't wait to get back to independence so that she could drive again. The little things that we all take for granted. I mean, again, think of that. Once you're a president or first lady, you're that way the rest of your life, whether you're in the White House or not. Your life has changed forever. And, you know, our friends the Carters are living testimony to that. They're both in their 90s, and Jan, George, you know, we all know how their life is different than it would have been if he had never been in the White House. Of course, we'll get to Rosalind. I'm very proud of this picture. It was sent to me a couple of weeks ago with her holding my new book, Symbols of Patriotism. I dedicated the book to her. She's got a note here that she wrote me about the first book and then about how she hoped I would do the First Lady's book when it came out. Because we were on the phone a few times back and forth for the Symbols of Patriotism book. Now, Rosalind, as First Lady, at least with me, what I always think of with her is a true partnership with her husband in everything they did. As a matter of fact, coming up this summer is their 75th wedding anniversary. And they've been a partner in everything. You know, when he was in the Navy, when he was governor, and when they got to the White House, it wasn't going to be any different. She was going to be a partner. President Carter will freely admit that she was his closest advisor. Time magazine called her the second most powerful person in the United States at the time. And I think that's cool. And Rosalind wanted that part of the role. She likes to be involved. She likes to have her opinion heard. And she's got great opinions. And they always had that partnership, which, you know, that just makes for an even better presidency, I think, when you have that kind of relationship. Rosalind, when she was 13 years old, her father died, leaving her mother in a financial problem. So Rosalind went out and got a few different jobs. She helped to raise her siblings, and she still managed to graduate valedictorian of her class. And I think that is just amazing. She was very shy, very soft-spoken, was afraid to speak in public, and she overcame that both when President Carter ran for governor and then especially when he ran for president and, of course, ran for re-election. And she went from being very shy and soft-spoken, even on a personal level, to giving speeches to thousands of people. And she, in her true partnership, she traveled all over the world for the president as a representative of the United States. Now, she was a White House hostess and wasn't opposed to doing that, but she wanted her role to be much more than that, which it was. Nancy Reagan, we touched on her a little bit. I line her with Sarah Polk as far as being a gatekeeper and kind of getting people a little bit mad at her in the higher levels of the administration. And also, as I mentioned, consulting an astrologer like Florence Harding did. And Nancy Reagan was very instrumental in getting some of these artifacts out of the archives and getting them back into the White House. Barbara Bush, I always label her as like the mother or grandmother of our nation, with that white hair and the pearls. You just can't help but love her when you just look at her picture. And she was I liked how she was very direct. You know, she said something to the effect of, you know, if I get this right, but for things to be better, I'm paraphrasing here, it doesn't really matter what happens in the White House, it matters what happens in your house. And I like things like that she said. Quick little story, then I'll take some questions for the next 10 minutes. Well, we'll talk about Laura Bush quickly, but quick little story on Barbara Bush. I got to meet her once. That was my first brush with greatness. But I was in an antique mall while I was in graduate school, where I had a little shop set up in there. And I went in one day, and the guy that worked there said, "Larry, Barbara Bush is about to go into your booth." And so I hightail it over there. And sure enough, she comes walking in. She had no Secret Service. She had given up her Secret Service. This was before George W. was on the radar for the presidency or anything. So she'd given up her Secret Service. It was just shortly after they came back from Houston. Or came back from Washington, moved to Houston, I'm sorry. And so when she walked in, I was like starstruck. And I just said, "Well, hello, Mrs. Bush." And she said, "Hello." And I said, "Welcome back to Houston." She said, "Well, thank you very much." And I said, "I just want to say, I don't want to bother you, but I just want to say thank you for everything that you and your husband have done for our country." And she stopped and she looked at me and she said, "What's your name, young man?" Well, I like the young man part, but I was then. And I told her, and she said, "I'm going home tonight and tell George you said that." Oh my goodness, I couldn't sleep that night. I'm like, are they sitting at the dinner table talking about me? This is crazy. So that was, and the other little funny part of that story is, again, no Secret Service. So, and she was just with a friend of hers. And they're walking down when they left my booth, and walking down, there's a huge antique mall. And they're walking down through, and some lady's coming toward them, not realizing who they are. And she's yelling at the kid, you know, "Wait till you get home. I'll tell your father." I'm thinking, oh my God, would you be embarrassed if you knew Barbara Bush was standing like 3 feet from you? Laura Bush, the last we have here. And by the way, these are both hand-signed by Nancy Reagan, Barbara Bush. Laura Bush, a hand-signed book plate. And again, talk about an influence on your husband. George W. admits freely that she changed his life. She convinced him to stop drinking and turned things around and, again, made history. And it was ironic because their lives were so parallel in Texas back when they were younger. They lived in the same apartment complex in Houston. They had the same friends, this and that, but they never really crossed paths until they went to a barbecue in Midland. And that's where they met, and then they struck up a relationship and became married shortly after that. But so I would like to open it up to questions, if anybody has any questions.
China story. The China story. Harding China
Hello.
You guys are good.
I'll come around if you
Thank
have a
you.
question for Larry.
Thank you. Yeah, she yelled out the first one here, the China story. I told him to remind me of the China story. I mentioned about Caroline Harrison doing the White House china painting, and she would, back in the Victorian times, that was the thing to do, was paint china, and Caroline was very adept at doing that. But anyway, fast forward to several years later in the 1920s when Warren Harding was in the White House. Warren would have his famous weekly poker games with his cabinet and staff and friends. And actually, the First Lady would serve alcohol there, and it was during Prohibition. But they had a requisition for medical reasons for the alcohol. But anyway, I don't know if she poured a little too much into Warren's one night or what, but he ended up gambling off a complete set of Caroline Harrison's china in a poker game. And that always gets the oh versus the ah. So, but if I get the response, that's good. But thank you. Thank you for
So we have
doing it.
time for a couple more questions. Anyone else have a question back here? I'm going to do my Phil Donahue thing now. Run.
Who is your favorite to research?
Oh, wow. I had fun with all of them, but I think Julia Grant was probably, as I was mentioning earlier, I think she was probably one of my favorites because I just loved how she was a cheerleader for her husband, and that kept coming up and up and up again throughout the research. So I guess if you really had to pin me down to one, I guess I would have to say Julia Grant for this book. Good question. Thank you.
Next question. Anyone?
I love questions, guys. Please, if you got questions, especially ones I can answer.
Well, Larry, then let me put you on the spot. Let me ask you a question.
Any questions out there?
Because he knows I'll throw a doozy at him.
Go
No,
ahead.
I mean, we all can remember when we fell in love with whatever hobby that we might have. So when did you actually go, yep, this is what I want to do forever, and or this is what I love?
Great question. Thank you, because I love telling this story. I started this when I was about 10 years old. Everybody thinks I'm a professor someplace or my degree is in history. It is not. I'm a self-made public historian. But what started it was my grandmother got me this little piece of paper with a Lincoln penny attached to it with the Kennedy image also embossed in it. And it listed all the similarities between Lincoln and Kennedy. And when I was little, I was about 11 then, I guess, I was amazed by that. And we'll back up a little bit because I think the thing that really made me like presidents was my first memory in life is November 22nd, 1963. I was 3 years old, and I can remember that day. Of course, that's the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. I get choked up thinking about it. I remember my parents' reaction to that. I don't remember November 21st or 23rd, but I remember that day. It did something in here. And so I always liked the presidents ever since that day. And then my grandmother gets me this piece of memorabilia. Of course, we didn't have Google then. Not that I'm that old, guys. But we didn't have Google then. And I went to the school library and I looked up all of those facts. My parents were always very supportive of everything that I wanted to do. They still are. I'm fortunate to still have my parents. And my grandmother was too. So they would get me other things. We didn't have a lot of money when I was a kid, but they'd get me a Nixon button, whatever. And every time I got a piece, I would go and research that. And I would make notes. I was intrigued by these personal, little-known facts. And the ironic thing is, the first president, when I got old enough to really be looking into him when I was like 14, 15 years old, when Jimmy Carter announced that he was going to run for president, and I started seeing all these pictures of Plains, Georgia. And I thought, they're like us. His mother reminded me of my grandmother. Billy reminded me of my favorite pickup truck driving uncle who would throw a beer can in the back when he was done with it. And I just was amazed at that. And I love to say this at most of my presentations, but you never know where life is going to lead you. And I would have never in my wildest dreams thought that someday I would be friends with the Carters and friends with these people in the audience here who've grown up with the Carters. And I mean, it's just ironic. And so the collection just kept growing. And as I got older, I could afford a little better stuff. and that's where we got.
All right. We have one more question over here. And then we're going to bring up our leader who's in the room now.
Do you still have some of your early pieces?
I still have that piece that my grandmother gave me. Quick little story, I don't want to run over. I think I got 30 seconds. But I was always wishing I had that piece my entire life. I never knew what I had really done with it. I'd moved several times, Texas, et cetera. And so my cousin, who we are like brothers, just a couple years apart, and he came to one of my presentations about maybe 2 years ago. And I had told that story. And so after the presentation, my cousin Keith came up to me, he said, look, I've got mine, I'm pretty sure, that Grandma gave me. He goes, I want you to have it. So I said, oh, Keith, you keep it. He said, no, I want you to have it. So he found his, and he gave it to me. About 3 weeks later, I get a call from my father. My parents are up there in age, and they're starting to sort some things out and downsize. And underneath the bed in a strong box, my dad opens up, and there's mine. So I tried to give my cousins back to him, but he wants me to keep it in the collection as well, which is really
You don't need
really
two.
cool. Yeah.
Surely you can find another collector.
But I'd love that story. Thanks
Well,
for asking that.
As we've heard, our first ladies were incredibly influenced by both their husbands as well as the rest of their family. We owe our first ladies a great deal of debt
We do.
as a country. Some of our greatest things in our history have come from first ladies. I mean, Mrs. Kennedy, I tell you a quick story about the airplanes that take care of the first family. It was Mrs. Kennedy who decided on the color scheme that is used today, the blue and white color scheme for Air Force One. Before the Kennedys came into office, the airplane was silver, black, with an orange stripe and a gold pinstripe. And Mrs. Kennedy, having a keen eye for design, thought that the airplane was a little too regal looking. As you know, Mrs. Kennedy remodeled the White House and did it so eloquently. And a lot of those rooms are still designed today and decorated today as they were when Mrs. Kennedy was there. But she's the one who came up with the design, changing the colors with the blue sky, the blue representing the blue sky, the white representing the clouds. And then if you look at the side of the airplane where it says United States of America, it's actually the same font as the title of the Declaration of Independence. So we can thank Mrs. Kennedy. And as far as I know, they are not changing the color scheme. They have decided to not change the color scheme. So we want to thank Dr. Larry Cook and remind everybody of his book, his latest book, Symbols of Patriotism, which Larry is going to be out in the lobby signing copies, as well as his first book. So go out there and get your copy and talk to this amazing author and historian.
And if you could just be patient with me I want to get the memorabilia off the
No,
stage.
you're going to
so we
go
can
out.
get
I'm going to take care of this for you so you can go meet your
sure?
fans. Yes.
Thank you, buddy.
But first, I'm going to bring up our leader, Reverend Nicholas Inman.
Hey,
Thank you. Let's
give them all a round of
It's got the
applause.
bubble
They're
wrap
doing
and,
Yep,
everything, and there's
okay.
some pieces still in there.
I'll take care of it.
Thank you.
Richard, come here a minute. You know, we've developed unique cherry blossom friendships over the years, and I just love our cherry blossom community and network. And I consider Larry one of my best friends, and the other aspect of that is Richard. And I want to thank Richard for filling in this morning doing introductions. So thank him for me as well. That's great. Larry, thank you. Well, the next speaker I know you're really going to enjoy. As the director of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home, I'm always receiving questions about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her sisters. And you often do not read a great deal about Carrie Ingalls. But to bring her to life for you, please put your hands together for Julie Hedgepeth Williams, who will be speaking about Carrie Ingalls.
Hi, dear. This is Larry. What do you need?
Give us just a moment while we get connected.